Excellent. So, as I say, welcome everyone to looking at chapters 4 to 8 of The Fire of Love by Richard Rolle. It's really great to welcome you all to our book group. What I wanted to have a look at this evening as this kind of introduction was I wanted to look at who is this person, Richard Rolle. Last week we focused a little bit on his text. And what is this text that we've got in front of us? But this week, I want to think about him as a person. Now, he's known as Richard Rolle of Hampole or de Hampole. And the reason for that is that towards the end of his life, he actually spent most of his time in that region of Hampole, which is now in South Yorkshire. And he was very attached to a number of nuns in the Cistercian nunnery there. So that's why he kind of got this addition to his name. So what do we know about Richard Rolle? Well, we know more than we certainly know about some of the other English mystics. The reason being is that there was a drive to actually canonize him. And to be able to canonize someone, you have to actually bring quite a lot of evidence of them being saintly, of having a holy life, and sort of some of the miracles that he would have performed. And this was all put into what was known as the Office of Lessons and Antiphons. This was drawn up, as I say, in preparation of his canonization in the 1380s. So that's where we get the information about his early life. Now, we have to remember that this was a document that was drawn up, which has quite a lot of hagiography to it. It's the life of a saint, but as we know, with lots of lives of saints, they sort of embellish the truth and the facts with stories, with an element of stories. So we have to kind of tease out a little bit of what may be the facts here and what may be actually quite a nice story that's sort of been added on to give a bit of flavour to the actual facts. And so when you read these office, and there are different lessons that tell of his history, they sound a bit like a good children's storybook. So out of that, we tease, as I say, some of the facts. Sadly, he was never actually officially canonized, which was a bit of a shame. But he did have a real cult following, especially in the north of England, and there was a shrine to him. But alas, that's all gone. For nearly 200 years, he had this cult following, which is really impressive, but also it just shows how much influence his writing and he as a person had at the time. So in these lessons, now I'm going to use the word probably quite a lot this evening. So please, you're going to hear that word a few times. But in these lessons, we learn that Rolle was born at Thornton near Pickering, which probably means Thornton-le-Dale in the North Riding of Yorkshire. And he was born, we're not quite sure, probably around 1300s, 1290s, 1300s, somewhere around that time. And his father, William, was probably a family retainer, farmer, a former retainer to John de Dalton himself, who's perhaps the younger son of Sir Richard Dalton of Bisham in Lancashire. So what we have is we have a family who is working for a landowner, but owns their own farm. So they actually have quite a lot of wealth of them of their own, but it means that they are still in that serfdom of the hierarchy of the society at the time. but he does have his own means, and therefore it's very likely that the family were able to provide for Richard's early schooling. But what is really clear is that they were unable to provide for him, had the means to send him to university. And instead, his university career was paid for by Thomas de Neville, the fifth son of Ralph, the first Lord of Raby, who was Archdeacon of Durham. So it's really interesting that it's the Archdeacon of Durham, so it's an ecclesiastical person who's actually funding Richard Rolle. So there must be something in his youth that impressed this cleric, this, scholar no less, to actually support him through his university. We don't know what, anything would be mere speculation, but the fact that it is the Archdeacon of Durham gives us an idea that he probably was well known, for maybe his piety or maybe his learning. So Rolle's patron and parents, I'm probably sure, would have been rather disappointed when Rolle, at the age of 19, in his 19th year, failed to return to Oxford after the long vacation in which he took up his calling as a hermit. And this is a wonderful, I must read this to you. It comes from the lessons, the Office of Lessons, and it just describes what happened. So during the long vacation from Oxford University, probably in his 5th year there, Rolle had asked his favourite sister for 2 of her tunics, a grey and a white, and trustingly she'd brought them to him as arranged in a little wood near their home. There he had vandalised both garments, ripping the sleeves from the grey and the buttons from the white tunic, and had then scandalised his sister by dressing up in them, wearing the white next to his skin and the now sleeveless grey tunic over it, completing the ensemble with his father's rein hood as a cowl. Wow, what a character! He must have been. I can just have this image of this young man sort of ripping these clothes apart. But I love the way they actually describe it. It's really quite something. So basically what was going on here is he would have been at Oxford University since about the age of 14 or 13, not the later age that students usually go up now. And he would have been expected to reach MA stage at the age of 21. Now, if he didn't get to his MA, if he didn't get a degree, he was unable then to proceed to what was known as major orders. He couldn't then preach, he couldn't teach, and he was disqualified from holding any kind of benefice. And of course, those of you who know the kind of church structures will know that if you hold your benefice, it means that's how you get your income, and that's the parish that you look after. So it's like being the rector of a parish, and that's where you got your living. So by running away from going rogue from his university career, he literally was running into the woods, throwing on his sister's clothes and becoming a hermit. So initially, and we get this, and we get the idea also from the lessons that he was really interested in theology and in biblical studies, but he really wasn't interested at all in philosophy or secular studies. And of course, Oxford at that time was really noted for the latter, and hence Richard Rolle was very dismayed at what he says the aridity of the curriculum. So there we are. wonder what Oxford is like today on its theology and biblical studies. Anyway, moving on. So initially, his life as a wandering religious located him quite near to home at the forest at Thornton. But he soon left that area because he feared that his family would try to restrain his life as a solitude. So leaving the kind of home, the area of the family home, he went over to Pickering and was housed there by a squire called John Dalton, probably for about 3 years. Now, John had known Richard from the Oxford days because the both of them had been students together. But if you remember, I said at the beginning that the lessons kind of embellish stories a little bit. So lesson 2 describes in quasi-miraculous style how on the 14th of August, Dalton's wife discovered Richard praying in her seat in the church. And of course, if you remember, in those days, the squire's seat was very much a place of honor, and no one else could sit there, let alone, just some peasant wandering in off the street. And so she finds Richard there and refuses to allow her sons to turf him out of the seat because she didn't wish to disturb him in his deep devotions. And then it goes on to describe how the following day, Richard donned on a surplice and unbidden sang the office of matins and assisted at the Mass of the Feast of Assumption. And then he was allowed to preach a sermon, which was, as the lessons say, of such power and virtue that all present were moved to tears. Now, after this Mass, it says once again in the lessons that Dalton invited Rolle to the main meal of the day, but he sat at the lowest seat and ate in silence, which of course would have been extremely rude to treat your host like that. But it's given as an example of his unworldly behavior. So as I say, the lessons give us a great story about how he becomes, how John Dalton becomes the patron of Richard Rolle. What we do know then is that Dalton housed Richard in a cell in his home and provided for him, and you'll be pleased to hear gave him a proper habit and also some food. So it's probably while he was still living with Dalton 2 years and about 8 months after becoming a hermit that he had his first mystical experience. And we heard a little bit about that in the opening of the prologue to Incendium Amoris, or the Fire of Love. And around a year later, he felt a similar experience after listening to a choir and began to take less and less interested in all things temporal. Now, there's a possibility, and scholars are very much divided on this, that in the early 1320s, Rolle spent time at Sorbonne, the great theological school over in Paris at Sorbonne, becoming very well trained in theology, and perhaps was ordained over there. Now, this theory is based on entries in 3 17th century manuscripts in Sorbonne, which record a Ricardus de Hampel being admitted to Sorbonne in the 1320s, entering there's an entry there in the Prior's Register in 1326, and noted that he died in 1349. Now, as I say, scholars are divided on this, and to be honest, I probably I'm on the side of the scholars who think this is unlikely. Now, the reason I'd say this is unlikely is because we have this attitude that Richard Rolle had about the schools in Oxford. It's not very likely that then he would travel over to France to go to similar schools over in France if he had left all that possibility of training here in Oxford and in England. And also it's because so many later manuscripts, so much medieval writing was attributed to Richard Rolle that it may well be that this Ricardus de Hampel, it was just a name put in the registers much later, and that it actually wasn't actually him at all. But as I say, you would have to go back and look at the sources, but it doesn't seem very likely to me. What's more probable is that Rolle spent much of his time in Richmondshire, either living with his family or wandering from patron to patron. That seems much more likely than him going off to France. We never have him in England as an ordained person actually doing any of the offices of an ordained person. So we have no evidence for that. So it seems likely that he just kept his vocation as a wandering hermit, and that he wrote all these texts that we know about actually for his different patrons. But what we do know is that towards the end of his life, he sort of settled down a little bit around the nunnery at Hampel in Yorkshire. This was much later in his life, and this is the place, as I say, where he died, but also where he acted as spiritual guide to a number of the nuns in the Cistercian nunnery there. One of the most important and the most significant was Margaret Kirkby. She was originally a nun, and then she became an anchoress, a bit like Gillian Norwich, and it's for her that he writes some of his most celebrated English texts, notably The Form of Living. And it's for another nun at Yeddingham that he wrote Ego Dormio. Sadly, he died quite young, only 1349, so only about 50 years old, at the Cistercian nunnery, and he died of Black Death. So he's one of those poor souls who died as a result of Black Death, and the nuns buried him in their cemetery at Hampel. So I wanted to read, yeah. So for those of you who weren't with us last week, I went through a lot of the text that he actually wrote, because he was a really prolific and versatile writer. Today, he's probably best known for his English contemplative epistles, which, as I say, were written for Margaret, along with The Form of Living, The Commandment, Ego Dormio, all written in around the 1340s. And this is also the period when we think he wrote the Latin text that we're looking at, Incendio Amoris, and has been translated for us. Now, one of the reasons that we are looking at this text rather than his English text is because this is slightly longer, and in it he really is in a sort of self-reflective mode, trying to understand his own mystical experiences and really to sort of dig deep into what he thinks is the experience of the fire of love, the mystical journey. And that's why it's a really interesting text for us to dive into. And as I say, we have an insight into that right at the beginning of the prologue. And then later we'll come into, I think about chapter 15, we'll really start looking at how he explains it, but also many of the hallmarks of what he thinks the mystical experience is about. The other thing about Incendium Amoris that's really helpful is that he does capture in this text some of his use of prose, but also of poetry, and also this kind of effusive and sincere writing that made him so captivating and popular in his day. Because when we start reading this text, we really do get a sense of the kind of person that Richard Rolle was. He strikes me as being a good Yorkshireman. You know, he calls a spade a spade. He calls sin, sin, love, love, good people, bad people. You know, we really do get that sense within his text. And there's also a bit of a wry humour. He's been quite criticised in the past for his sort of anti-feminist, you know, he gives women a really hard time. And we'll see this in chapter 12 when we get to it. But some commentators, particularly Rosemary Allen, in her excellent introduction to the English writings, which form part of the classics of Western spirituality, she sees that in this chapter, when we get to it, that there's a kind of self-deprecating and a wry humour about him, which reveals that element of self-caricature that's equal to the best of Chaucer, for those of you who know your Chaucer. And as I've said, Richard Rolle, he had a really lasting impact on the spirituality of his times. It's really clear that he, as I said, had this prolific range of works, from handbooks for priests, commentaries on the Psalms, biblical books, books of ascetic guidance, letters, poems, meditations, and also this semi-autobiographical work, Incendium Amoris. So all these texts, really prolific. And last week I just went through some of the manuscripts that we have. You know, he's the most manuscripts we have of the English mystical tradition are by Richard Rolle. And later, even more texts were attributed to him, which weren't actually by him. So trying to pick out the ones that actually he wrote and what was attributed to him, it can be quite tricky at times. But even those who we think that are particularly his texts are quite outstanding in their range. And I guess that's why he had this enormous reach. Was he wrote in Latin, but he wrote in vernacular, he wrote for biblical, he wrote for clergy, and then he also wrote for religious in this form of spiritual direction. So there we are, good old Richard Rolle. And it's really wonderful looking at this text together and just dipping our toe in to some of his writing. So there's my introduction for this week.